You're listening to episode 144 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Meditation teacher Josh Korda speaks with us about how his work in addiction recovery is informed by his own experiences, traditional Buddhist thought, and modern science. Craving. That's what we struggle with. Whether it's a light interest in having our relaxing afternoon continue to be relaxing, or the more damaging physical and psychological addictions that many of us are suffering from, craving is there. And there are a lot of ways we can deal with that craving. Sometimes just ignoring it does the trick, but not always, and not for addictions. What is often needed to cope with these problems isn't just one solution. We're more complicated creatures than that. Instead, with our variety of inclinations, a variety of ways to help us may be more effective. There are traditional views and practices from Buddhism, support processes like 12-step programs, and finding the right mix for the individual requires dedication, sincerity, and deep compassion. Josh Korda has been meditating for over 2 decades and began his studies in Theravada Buddhism in 1996. He has been the teacher at New York Dharma Punk since 2005 and at Monday night Brooklyn Dharma class. For the last 3 years, Josh has been a visiting teacher at zencare.org, a non-profit organization that trains hospice volunteers, and gives talks at Meditate New York. Having taught at newyorkimc.org, Josh has volunteered for many years as an attendant at their retreats. Josh received his initial teacher training with Noah Levine and has had the honor to study with countless other spiritual practitioners, including Ajahns Jeff, Suchito, Amaro, Brahm, Vajiro, Sharon Salzberg, and Tara Brock, to name a few. All of Josh's Dharma talks can be found at dharmapunksnyc.podbean.com, which is followed by a large online community. Special thanks to our friend Dave Smith for suggesting this interview with Josh. So sit back, relax, and have a nice herbal mint tea. And our guest today is Josh Korda. Josh, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's a great honor. I had a note from our friend Dave Smith from episode 76 talking about you and that you would be a wonderful person to talk with based on your work with Dharma Punks in New York. And before we go into that, Josh, why don't you tell us about your background and how you came to this practice?
Well, I guess the most straightforward way to put it would be in the 1970s when I was a young kid, my dad, who had been pretty low-bottom drunk, out of the blue, got sober, and it very much changed, obviously, everything in the family when suddenly a sort of raging drunk, suddenly out of the blue, gives up his addictions. And so my dad, when he entered AA, he basically had I think a negative association, certainly, with a spiritual path of his childhood, which was Russian Catholic. My mom was Jewish. My dad was from that background. And so he, I think, had been exposed to Buddhism back with his interest in, he was a painter, and so he had heard about it, and he became very interested and joined Peter Matheson's group, who's a writer and a Zen Buddhist who had a group out, I think in Long Island, where my dad spent a lot of time. So out of the blue, suddenly there were these cushions and zafus and books, and he would take me as a kid to hear visiting roshis. He was very much in the Zen tradition, and so it became part of sort of like, my dad sort of liked to hijack family members into his latest adventures. So basically, we would be brought to, hear different Buddhist teachers. This is all the way back in the 70s, and so, as they passed through the city or came to speak at the Ethical Culture Society or I can't remember the center we would go to, but anyway, he brought us there. So I knew about it, and from a very young age, I was out of curiosity reading the books, and then when over the years, as my addictions took off, I sort of held it in the back of my head that if it ever got bad enough, which it certainly did, that I knew that there were ways out. There was AA and there was Buddhist practice in conjunction. So I guess basically my practice was very secondary to my alcoholism until my early 30s, and this was back in the middle 90s, and I just realized it had gotten bad enough, a whole lot of messy events in life and financial problems, and I just decided enough was enough. And after the obligatory rehabs and detoxes and hospitals and stuff like that, I got clean, and I knew from word go in sobriety that my path was I've always been inclined towards Buddhist practice. I've never had an interest in theistic spiritual practices, and I've always thought that the solution was largely an inside job rather than a spirituality based on an external God. So I really then started excuse me, beyond the daily practice I had about 18 years ago. I really started just researching different, Buddhist groups that I could sit with, and I settled upon the Theravada and eventually Dharma punks.
So what was it that you found most appealing to Theravada practice? Because a lot of folks who are listening, they'll resonate with one particular practice or another. What was it for Theravada that appealed to you?
I found Zen to be a very beautiful practice, but I'm pretty, I guess, philosophical / scientific guy by nature, and I found the teachings when I both heard them at places I would go to sit, and also the books that I read, whether it was Philip Kapleau or the Dogen or whether it was
Three Pillars of Zen or the Shobogenzo or something.
Yeah, exactly. And the Soto, D.T. Suzuki and all that. Whatever I read, I found the language to be very abstract, and I found the teaching to be very difficult for me to wrap my head around. That's not to say that there's any lack of value. It's a wonderful tradition, but for me, it just didn't register. And the Theravada, when I picked it up and I started reading the sort of first books that I got, I think they're like one was a translation of the discourses by Bhikkhu Bodhi. I got many years ago, and I started just reading it, and I found the suttas and the Pali Canon to be very step by step, easy to grasp. It was almost like they were a recipe for happiness. Each sutta was like, okay, you're suffering for this reason, and here's what you need to do to stop feeling anxious. And so each, sutta had that qualities, and even the suttas that were difficult, I could work through and I could make sense of them. Whereas I just found the language in Zen to be very difficult to parse. And Tibetan I tried as well, but the retreats and the sittings I did with Zen, I found that there was a whole host of other stuff that had been put in to Tibetan Buddhism that I couldn't. The visualizations, the various gods, or the way human states are sort of laid out in characters and stuff like that, and the maras and all that. I just couldn't really get with. So for me, the Theravada was the most sort of straightforward, scientific, easy for my mind to grasp.
Yeah, and you said that very well, that it's not that there's anything wrong with those other traditions. It's just that your inclination from where you are and what appeals to you is something else.
Absolutely. I mean, I know people actually that I'm really close with that are, actually one of my closest friends in the Buddhist path is Chodo of Village Zendo, and Koshin, and a whole bunch of other guys at Village Zendo, and I really totally respect them, and I love their work and engaged Buddhism, and their work. I'm a visiting teacher at zencare.org, but each of us responds where the heart and our mind and our own upbringing, responds to, and it's not really so much, it's just where you respond.
Yeah. So how did you then connect up with Noah and Dharma Punks?
Noah I met through a friend, and he just moved to the city to start a Buddhist community, and I was there from the beginning, and he was at that point just giving talks at Tibet House, and I was not only going to this, but I was helping, I guess, do some of the promotion for his talks, because I was excited that there was a Theravadan inclined teacher in a city that I found very easy to relate to, and so we were talking, and he said, "Oh, I found a center," and so I was there when we started the New York Dharma Punk Center on the Bowery, and then it just basically came about through word of mouth, and I was very excited that somebody who had a background in punk rock like I do, and had a background in who also, because of his tattoos, like I have tattoos.
I was going to ask about those later.
We both, Noah's story is not that dissimilar to mine, in that we're both sober, and he also grew up in a family where his father is a Buddhist. So our stories were similar enough, and also I think we both didn't feel that comfortable in other sanghas, even in the Theravada, because when you go to those places and you're covered with tattoos and you have a background and sort of punk rock and stuff like that, sometimes the middle-aged white people who are very friendly, but still you don't feel that at home.
Yeah, it's not your community, and there's a distance there just based on being human. You've got a more colorful background, and that can be a little off-putting to some folks who didn't grow up with that.
Yeah, it's not even, and I've never ever had a situation in any Buddhist community where people were not welcoming. It's more that it's just that sense that it's akin to the thing that allows you to get sober in AA, that when you try to get sober with doctors or psychiatrists, you still get the feeling that you're around people that don't really get you. So it's difficult to share and be open and to your heart to open. But when you're with people that you immediately have a sense of connection with, then it becomes much easier to share and feel less isolated or different or unique. And of course, isolation and uniqueness is probably the greatest sources of suffering that we have. So it's sort of a prerequisite to have a community that you feel at home and not that different.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. May be a good segue into a lot of your work with addiction and recovery. Do you teach meditation as part of that process?
Well, I mean, when I sponsor people, excuse me, in 12-step environments, I don't insist that any of my sponsees at the beginning do meditation. I sort of work with them in the more traditional 12-step manner. But in terms of when I do teach at Buddhist centers and I do give talks there on addictions and working with ingrained habits and compulsions and stuff like that, then certainly that's much more upfront meditation and mindfulness. So it really depends on the context. If I'm in a 12-step context, which is much less, frankly, than I'm in a Buddhist context, but when I am in a 12-step context, I generally do introduce meditation in the order that it's introduced in 12-step practice, which is the 11th step, which is a little bit down the road. In Buddhist, obviously, practice, samadhi meditation is very much one of the three pillars of the Eightfold Path and the path to lasting happiness. So it's got to be done pretty much up front.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, do you find, with your background as someone who's not been as inclined towards, say, monotheistic religious ideals, do you run into some challenges sometimes with parts of the 12-step program when you're in that context of things like the higher power and stuff like that? How do you square that with supporting someone who needs that help?
Well, I mean, it's definitely a very divisive part of the experience, which is, on one hand, tries to maintain that it's, non-sectarian, that it has an open-mindedness, and it sort of purposely uses the phrase higher power to open it up to a non-theistic approach to a higher power. But then throughout the meetings you go to and throughout the literature and throughout the sort of fellowship, people still do tend to hit heavily the God concept. And they also tend to say things like, I know that my mind is not a safe place to be. The solution's got to be entirely external and stuff like that. And that's a mind state that's very foreign to my spiritual outlook.
Yeah, yeah.
So I tend to tell my sponsees that I have sponsees that believe in God and also go to Dharma punks. I have sponsees that don't believe in God. I have sponsees that use for their higher power, for example, karma, cause and effect.
Things outside of my control.
Right, or for example, you can use metta, kindness, compassion as a higher power. You can use the Buddha, the idea that awakening can happen if we turn our attention inwards and look for our lasting happiness in our own experience rather than trying to get it entirely from the world and relationships and careers and stuff like that. So there's other solutions to higher power. And if somebody expresses to me that they're having any trouble identifying what to use as a higher power, I just give them all the different solutions that I've heard people successfully use. I don't push a Buddhist higher power
Right,
over
right.
a theistic conception, but I guess it's safe to say that most of my sponsees in the 12-step environment gravitate towards me because they know that I'm a guy who's not going to require an external God-based higher power. So most of them don't fall under the sort of traditional version of a higher power.
So when you are within the context of someone who's going through a recovery process, and they are within, say, a Dharma punks focused than a traditional 12-step, and you are engaging with them in helping them with a meditation practice, are there different challenges that you need to be aware of and deal with when it's someone who's struggling with a recovery process as well?
The only difference, in my experience, between people who are addicts or alcoholics and the rest of the general population, everybody has stress and suffering. Everybody's stress and suffering is caused by an unrealistic desire to escape what can't be escaped. Everybody's solution in terms of dropping that craving is the same. The difference between alcoholics and addicts and the rest of the population is alcoholics and addicts have this experience of they take a pill or a drink and all of their problems instantly go away. And it's this, and they're transported to this realm of there's no problem at all in my life. It's all been fixed. And in my experience, most people, when they when they get drunk, they do experience a sense of the edge being taken off and a sense of relaxation, but they don't have a feeling like, oh my God, I'm a genius. I can talk to anyone. People love me. All my problems have evaporated. I never have to do anything but this ever again. Just get drunk and it'll solve everything. So it's that sort of magic bullet effect that alcoholics and addicts have, that you just need to do this one thing over and over again and it'll fix everything. That sort of makes a little bit of a difference. And so I think that when it comes to teaching a spiritual path, I think that the general population has a little bit more experience that it's not going to be that easy. It's going to require effort. That addicts and alcoholics tend to transfer that belief that there's a magic bullet, that it should be really easy, into everything. We look for it in sex and shopping and in any endeavor, gambling. They just try to transfer it around like crazy. Look for that magic bullet. All right, it's not in my drinking. I have to give that up, and maybe, So then there's this hope. Okay, well, I heard about this meditation thing. Maybe if I just sit down and breathe, all my problems will go away. So you have to do a lot more managing of expectations and explaining that, it's a long process. And for the very first step of meditation, it's often very uncomfortable because rather than running from issues, we're confronting them. So I guess that's the biggest difference.
Josh, I imagine you also need to spend a bit of time reinforcing the cause and effect paradigm that, yeah, you can have that drink or take the pill or shoot up or whatever it is, but you have to do it again and again, and long term it's not helping you. Is that a message you kind of need to repeat a few times?
Well, but generally, hopefully, by the time somebody's come if they're in recovery, they sort of have seen that it's not working. Very few people go into a church basement on a Friday evening when they could be at their favorite bar, unless they realize that the solution is not working for them. It's, in my experience, most people, there's a twin thing that has to be done, which is the stress that the mind creates becomes so great that they know that it's not going to work in the long term, but still they want the immediate release anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the second issue is that introducing the possibility that there is another way of dealing with stress and suffering other than drinking, taking drugs, that there is a solution. And so that in 12-step language, that's basically falls under the rubric of the second step, which is being restored to sanity by another way of life. And in Buddhist, it basically falls under the landscape of conviction, which is the faith that when we do practice, when we do put in the effort to sustain mindfulness and relax the breath and the body and focus the mind and greet things as they arise rather than resisting, that practice will pay off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's shift gears a little bit to something that you and I share as an interest, and that is the early traditions, the Pali Canon, and these contemporary understandings of mind. You're very interested in presenting and integrating the insights of the Pali Canon with these new advances in science and psychology and philosophy. I guess one of the first things I'd like to ask you about that is, are you finding that there's an appetite for that people are interested in hearing about that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's a wonderful development that modern neuroscience has equipped Dharma teachers who are at least interested or open to it with so many tools to explain the Buddhist concepts. For example, there's so many examples to start with, but if you're teaching, for example, no self or not self, the lack of a lasting core identity that can be uncovered through our experience. If you just simply say that, then people have to suss out whether that's their experience or not, and how do you wrap your mind around that. But then if you sort of have as a tool to explain that, the fact that, when neuroscience with fMRI scans looks at the human mind, there's no single region that's always firing. There's no single part. You'd expect to see, if there was a core self or a core identity, you'd expect to see some region of the brain always turned on when you were thinking, or, but there isn't. It's just different regions firing at different times, interacting in different ways. And the more that we look at the research, the more we realize that the idea of a coherent, lasting identity or a self is actually just an illusion. And that's what the Buddha taught. But when people hear that told in a different a different language or different examples, or, the fact that science is backing that up, it makes that leap that you have to make a lot easier. Because it's a little bit, some of the Buddhist teachings do require, because they're so running against the stream, that it does help to have science on your side, and I'm glad it is.
Yeah, the idea that we have a very challenging practice. It's not easy to do this and to be mindful and to engage moment by moment as much as we can, to be able to point to an fMRI or point to an interview in an article by, a Dan Siegel or Richie Davidson or someone who can describe, and here's what happens in the brain. Here's why that's occurring. You can take advantage of neuroplasticity and have it, I think Dan Siegel's phrase is self-directed neuroplasticity. How great is that? That's what we're doing. And to be able to have that example is so helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's, if Siegel wrote, was it Buddha's Brain?
Buddha's Brain is Rick Hansen.
Oh, Rick Hansen, right. And in Buddha's Brain, Hansen summarizes some terrific findings about the nature of perception.
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is just how, as he quotes a neuroscientist named Rakel, who basically says that the mind recreates reality. In fact, very little of the visual or the auditory things we experience are actually really occurring. They're generally created by the mind, and that we just have enough of a map of the world that we don't, in quotes, bump into the furniture. Now, when you have that as a tool, as a teacher, then you can point to the Buddha's teaching in the Dhammapada that the mind is the forerunner of all things. And the mind is basically creating what we experience. It's not just the world flooding into our minds that we're getting an accurate portrayal, but actually our experience is extremely filtered, extremely subjective, extremely driven by craving and aversion. And so these tools are very helpful.
Yeah, they are. And Rick was on the podcast before, and he was a wonderful interview. He was very friendly, very engaging. And he also is someone who does have a religious practice as part of his life. And yet we can still have this wonderful engagement about the efficacy of meditation, what's actually happening in the brain. What I find most exciting is how, using different language, as you had said, we're pointing to very much the same process, and that's very beneficial to people as a whole. You don't need to be a particular traditional background in order to do this.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I come from in a sense, I do come from a traditional background because I still use a lot of the Pali terms and the Buddha's way of breaking down our experience into the aggregates. I know that there are a lot of Buddhists now, like Shinzen Young, and who are basically rewriting the concept so that it's easier to grasp in our culture. I don't do that. I actually like to stay with the Pali phrases and the way the Buddha modeled the brain, but I like to do that in conjunction with explaining it and making it clear using science, clinical psychology, philosophy, all the tools available.
So there's an interest in having this. What are some of the positive responses you've had with making those ties, with showing how this 2.5 millennia old practice is still every bit as effective for our contemporary Western audience? What are some of the good things that have come out of that?
Well, I mean, just generally the way when people ask questions, or when we have the open sharing in the groups, that it's clearly very exciting. A lot of the shares, a lot of the emails, a lot of the podcasts that I make that discuss those issues are the most popular, the ones that people write and ask me questions about, so basically in every way I get feedback I teach 2 or 3 times a week, and the groups have anywhere from 40 to 90 people in them, and generally the questions and the comments and the contact I get are invariably about people excited about either A, learning more about the basic practice, but then B, also learning more about neuroscience and how it intersects with spiritual practice.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of your teaching, correct me if I'm wrong, you did some online instruction through Tricycle, is that correct?
It was unique. I really didn't have... I've been videoed while giving talks before, but they're always in the context of a class, so there's people to look at. And then when the Tricycle crew came over, basically, we shot it in my backyard, which is not unusual. They shoot a lot of their online retreats at people's houses. But there was nobody there. The two guys that were videoing it were sitting off to the side. It was just basically me and the camera. So it was unusual, basically giving a talk to nobody.
A camera. Yeah, not a lot of feedback. Not a lot of feedback from a lens.
But, I mean, they were happy with it. I found it to be a growing experience because I didn't really know. A lot of the times over the years, as I've taught, retreats and my classes, and you sort of learn to look around and see if people are digesting, if the pace is right, if you're giving them, if you're chunking the information, if you need to stop and explain something. But in that scenario, there's really nothing to get feedback from. So that was the unusual quality of it.
Awesome. I got one more question that's a little off topic. You've got some awesome tattoos on you. What's your favorite?
I don't really have any favorites. They're all, a lot of them I drew, like the ones on my arms, the ones on my head, my friend Gene and some other friends who are tattoo artists created. My friend Gene did an ice cream cone with a skull in the ice cream that I liked on the back of my leg. I guess honestly the ones that I most gravitate to are the Buddhist-y ones. I have Anicca, Anatta, and Dukkha on me, and they definitely serve like a real purpose. So.
Yeah, you're carrying a reminder with you. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. Well, our guest today has been Josh Korda, and I want to give a couple of website addresses for the listeners. The first one is dharmapunksnewyorkcity.com, and that's DHARMA punks, PUNXNYC.com. And then in addition to this, the podcasts that Josh was mentioning are on that as well. It's dharmapunksnewyorkcity.podbean.com. And again, I'll have links to both of those and to some other articles and things that Josh has written and about him. So be sure to come to the episode page for this episode. Josh, thanks so much for being here. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.